Good afternoon. I'm Nelson Wise, treasurer of the City Club. I want to welcome you all here today to meet with us and to listen to the Honorable John Lehman, Secretary of the Navy. John Lehman was appointed to his present position by President Reagan on January 23, 1981, and was confirmed by the Senate on January 29th and took the oath of office on February 5. Prior to this appointment, he was president of Abington Corporation, a Washington, D.C. based management firm specializing in defense matters. His long experience in defense and foreign affairs includes 5 years as special counsel and senior staff member to Henry Kissinger on the National Security Council, and 2 years as Deputy Director of the United States Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. He holds a PhD degree in International Relations from the University of Pennsylvania. It's a great pleasure to have with us today the Honorable John Lehman, Secretary of the Navy.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a particular pleasure for me to be here in Cleveland today. I am particularly pleased to have the opportunity to not only speak to all of you and to report to you on the state of our defense recovery program and the state of our Navy and Marine Corps, but also to have the opportunity to hear from you and to hear some of your thoughts and to answer some of your questions. I'm going to try to keep as much time available for that part of the program as I can. I am becoming increasingly sensitive to the criticisms of my staff that I tend to go on rather long when I get talking about the Navy and the Marine Corps. I realized how this can be counterproductive over the Christmas holidays when I took my family to the Christmas services at the Naval Academy, to the chapel at the Naval Academy, which is a beautiful chapel, particularly the stained glass windows. And the preacher went on very long in that particular ceremony, and keeping a 5-year-old under control as you approach the second hour of homilies is a difficult task. And while as she became increasingly restive, she looked up at the stained glass windows and said, "Daddy, what are those pretty windows up there?" And I said, "Therefore, they're in memory of those alumni who have died in service." And she said, "Was that the Easter service or the Christmas service that they died?" Well, I'll do my best to keep the body count low today, and hopefully we won't take any losses as I speak. It's hard to keep the time limited because we have so much going on in the Navy and Marine Corps today that I have trouble reining in my excitement when I try to describe to the public what is going on. It is a truly great period in the history of our armed forces, and particularly our Navy and Marine Corps. A year ago, the new president, the new administration laid out an ambitious program to reacquire what President Reagan called the margin of safety that we had lost. We had lost it through a combination of 15 years of deferred investment due to the Vietnam War and the post-Vietnam period that coincided with 15 years of solid, sustained, massive growth in arms expenditure by the Soviet Union. And here we are 15 years later with a fleet that's half the size of the fleet that the United States had when I first joined the government with Henry Kissinger 13 years ago, and with a Soviet fleet that is at least trebled in capability, if not numbers, since that time. And similar ratios have begun to emerge in other areas of our defense balance. And therefore we see, not surprisingly to those of us who make our profession in the defense field, an increasing willingness of the Soviets to engage in adventures around the world that are directly threatening to our interests. Aggression in Afghanistan and in the Horn of Africa, and now developments that we see unfolding in Central America, to name but a few, because they feel that this great new military capability that they have invested in at such sacrifice allows them a risk-free environment in which to pursue interests inimical to those of the free world. And so the President has laid before the American people an ambitious program to bring about a recovery, and to bring it about not with a massive arms race. He is not calling for a major reordering of American priorities, as some in the press have suggested. One should bear in mind the perspective of where we have come from and where we are today in terms of priorities in spending. When I first started studying and following these matters, in the middle of the Kennedy administration, the defense share of the federal budget was about 50% of federal spending. It was taking about 8% of the gross national product, down just a little bit from what it was in the Eisenhower years. Years, of course, when we had virtually zero inflation. And now, today, the defense share of the GNP has shrunk, if you take retirement out, to about 4.9%. President Reagan has proposed to grow that to almost 7%, but nothing approaching the 8 to 9% of those years of the late 50s and early 60s. He is proposing to raise the share of defense spending that has reversed since President Kennedy's day, to where now defense spending is about 25% of federal spending, whereas social programs have doubled in that period as a percentage of federal spending. And President Reagan is proposing to increase the share of defense spending to a maximum of about 36%, not the 50% of President Kennedy. So one must keep that in perspective. But more importantly, what troubles me as I listen to the debate that goes on in Congress today that suggests that somehow defense must be treated as only one of a spread of competing social services that has no more or no less claim than other aspects of social welfare programs, however required they might be. The fact is that defense is the first social service. It must be served first and foremost before any social programs can be secure. If we allow the defense balance to deteriorate to the point of instability, and we are right there today, then the cost to the taxpayer of an outbreak, of another war, limited or whatever, is so enormously greater than any share of expense that the Reagan increases involve, that it really makes the debate, in my judgment, beyond serious discussion. Today, we have allowed our capabilities to deteriorate to a point where, for the first time in this century, the naval leadership of this country has testified that we can no longer say we have the capability to meet our minimum defense interests simultaneously. That is an awesome state of affairs to have developed. It is awesome because we are the maritime power, the maritime alliance, whereas the Soviet Union is a basic land power. We depend on the seas, the free world, for our very lifeblood. The maritime alliance of the free world cannot endure without guaranteed access between NATO and the United States, between the United States and Japan, between the sources of oil and of vital minerals, and all of the free nations. If we lose that access, if we lose the capability to support our allies, to support our committed troops, to maintain a supply of oil, to maintain a supply of the 24 out of 27 major minerals that we are totally dependent on foreign sources for, then we cannot continue to exist as a free nation. It is as simple as that. And yet that is precisely the objective that the buildup of the Soviet maritime interdiction power has been designed to carry out. There can be no other explanation for this sustained buildup that has built a force of 300 nuclear submarines and conventional attack submarines, of a surface combatant fleet that is some 30% larger than ours in major ships, and far larger counting patrol and coastal combatants, that has now for the first time deployed a new class of aircraft carrier and a larger nuclear class of aircraft carrier coming on, and that is deploying for the first time a permanent blue water interdiction fleet in the Pacific and around the world. This is no longer a nice to have part of our budget when we speak of our naval recovery. If we don't carry out the recovery program that has been put forward to restore maritime superiority, then the time will come when we will have to face up in the very near future towards withdrawing from the web of some 40 treaty commitments that bind us to regional defense alliances in NATO and in the Far East, in Latin America, that reflect the will of Congress and of various all succeeding post-war administrations, that these reflect, these joint defense agreements, our vital interests. We simply can no longer continue to delude the world and ourselves that somehow we can do more with less. We cannot do more with less. We can do less with less. And we will have to adjust our interests in the world to be commensurate with our capabilities to defend those interests. Now, the program that President Reagan has put forward to regain this stabilizing capability to defend our maritime interests is an expansion of some 30% to 15 carrier battle groups and a 600-ship Navy, and to achieve it by the end of this decade. And breaking with the tradition of recent history, where administration after administration submits budgets that don't have very much for the Navy in the first year, but they say in the last years of the 5-year plan, we're then going to start ramping up. President Reagan has put his investment up front. We have crystallized the issue for Congress and asked them to face up to it. Either we're going to expand to meet our minimum commitments, or we're not. This is the year to make the decision. We have put the investment up in this year's budget for 2 full aircraft carriers, 2 Trident subs, and a total of 25 new and converted and recommissioned ships, including another battleship and a balanced force of other ships to go with it. And we have put forward a new business plan with a new degree of accountability and strict contracting discipline, multi-year procurement, that we have enabled Congress to see nearly $1 billion in savings to the taxpayer by facing up to this issue now, buying, not actually receiving, but committing to procure 2 aircraft carriers instead of incrementally one by one. This enables the contractors to plan ahead, to start hiring and training the skills and trades necessary to produce efficiently and at great savings. And we have decided to be upfront about it and to invite Congress to face up to the issue. Because if we don't break out of the syndrome of cost increases by deferrals and cuts from Congress, we will never, ever have the chance to bring about a naval recovery again. And so the debate we see focusing in Congress today is, in my judgment, the most crucial defense debate that has ever gone on in peacetime. Because beyond a shadow of a doubt, if we do not carry out this recovery program this year, we will never, ever be able to carry it out again. That is plain fact. Over the last 15 years of decline, we have forced some 30 small suppliers and medium suppliers out of our supplier base in the Navy, 30,000, because of the reduced buys and the increase in regulation and red tape. And as a result, we have driven the unit costs up. We have built in an inflation rate in the defense industries higher than the industry at large because of these uneconomical cutbacks, in part by the administrations and in part by Congress. Now we have reversed that. We have submitted to Congress a list of some 60 initiatives taken by defense industries to put their profits into improving productivity, investing now so that the unit cost savings to us will be affordable to the taxpayer. We are able to demonstrate in program after program that we are actually bringing the real dollar cost down, not up, in program after program. I must confess to a certain amount of frustration that I have seen growing in the last 6 months or so, because we've been able to bring forth good news in procurement, cost underruns, ahead of schedule. Yet I fail to see any reporting of this in the press. As one example, tomorrow we will commission 2 major naval ships, the Carl Vinson, a new nuclear aircraft carrier, and a destroyer down in Pascagoula, Mississippi. The Carl Vinson is being delivered 34 days ahead of schedule and $24 million under the contract cost. $24 million saved for the taxpayer. The destroyer will deliver on schedule, saving the taxpayer $50 million under contract cost for a buy of 4 destroyers. Yet, how many of you have read about that? I dare say very few, because that kind of news doesn't get picked up. Only the few programs that we have that bust their ceilings and do overrun. That's news. Waste, fraud, and abuse. But I am here to tell you that the cost overruns and the programs that do get into trouble are by far and away the great exception. We have delivered each of the last 15 frigates to the Navy below cost, ahead of schedule. Yet how many of you have read about that? I testified 2 weeks ago that as a result of the bonuses that we were able to get through Congress last year to pay a bonus to our aviators, we can demonstrate a real dollar savings to the taxpayer of $450 million in saved training costs, because we have immediately jumped retention from about 28% to about 48%. Yet how many of you read that in the papers when we reported that? It doesn't sell, unfortunately. I could go on and on about the improvements that we have made because the news is good. The news is good on every front, in personnel retention, in our business procurement, in our contracting, and yet all that the focus of attention is on waste, fraud, and abuse in the military, and the Defense Department must take its fair share of cuts. Let me tell you what will happen if proposals like that of Senator Metzenbaum and others to slash into the defense budget this year are carried out. For every $1 billion that comes out of the Navy budget this year, there will be 42,000 jobs lost in this country. And as you well know, Ohio is very heavy in our defense subcontractor base. Every $1 billion that's cut out of the defense budget, I can guarantee you, is going to impact this state in an inordinate way. And for what? What will those kinds of cuts do to our deficit problem, real though that may be? The leverage in the shipbuilding account is absolutely without value to the balanced budget issue. It takes us 8 years to spend out every item in the SCN account, our shipbuilding account. So if you cancel the entire shipbuilding account and eliminate any new ships, $19 billion in that account this year, you save less than $1 billion on a $100 billion deficit. Yet you give up the future. You mortgage the future in a way that makes recovery, in my judgment, impossible for the future. Even if you cut out one carrier from the two, you are immediately driving the cost to the taxpayer of that carrier that remains up by about $500 million. And the cancellation of the other carrier, taking out some $3.5 billion out of the budget, saves the budget only $200 million for the deficit in 1983. So it would be the height of national tragedy for this current trendiness of cutting the defense budget to be actually carried out, because it can do nothing of any consequence to improve the budget balance problem, yet it will devastate our capability ever to recover a secure and stable peace in the world ahead. So I would urge you all to think about that and to think about the consequences of this kind of short-sighted debate that some are advocating in Congress today. The consequences of staying with the budget and of carrying forward this defense recovery program, in my judgment, are so apparent, so real, and so achievable in the near term that too should be debated first. The payoff, I believe, will take place very soon in the capability to reestablish confidence in the entire world that we are back in the business of maintaining stability and maintaining the peace. That if challenged in Europe, that NATO will be able to resupply and maintain a conventional deterrence and to avoid any risk of escalation to nuclear war, and that the perception of friend and foe alike around the world, that we indeed will have this capability before the end of this decade, will do more to improve the prospects for peace and to improve the environment in which our trade and our economic health depend than any other developments in any other field that I can foresee. And really, time is, in my judgment, on our side. Events in Poland, I think, demonstrate to the world that time is not on the side of the totalitarians. After 40 years, the Soviet Union has made not 1 inch of progress in winning the true allegiance of the captive nations in Eastern Europe. And demographics and economics are working against them. Their economy is a stagnant economy. Their future in renewable resources is a threatening one. Time is on the side of the free nations. If we can secure this decade and get through the dangers that have been allowed to develop in the next 5 to 10 years, I am confident the long-term future for our children is going to be a far less threatened one, a more stable and a more peaceful one than any of us here have known in our time. That is something well worth making whatever short-term economic sacrifices are necessary to sustain this recovery program that the President has courageously put before the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Secretary Lehman. Today at the City Club, we're listening to the Secretary of the Navy, the Honorable John Lehman, speaking to us on what should now be fairly clear and what I overlooked to mention to you at the beginning of this talk was building a 600-ship Navy. In just a moment, we'll turn to our traditional question period, but first some announcements. As most of you know, but some of you may not, and therefore it bears repeating, the City Club is a completely non-exclusive organization, open to all public-minded citizens who like to keep up on what's going on in the community, our country, and the world. We want you to feel free to join us as an official member. Our membership is always open, so give us a call, 621-0082, for more information, or stop by our offices at 320 Superior Avenue across the street from the main library downtown. Today, as always, we have with us students who are participating in our Living Seminars program, which we sponsor in cooperation with the Cleveland Board of Education. There are now students with us today from the following high schools: Benedictine, Collinwood, Holy Name, John Marshall, Maple Heights, Mayfield, Shaker Heights, Solon, and Westlake. Would they stand, please, to receive our welcome? Thank you. They will be meeting with Secretary Lehman for their own seminar following our forum here. We have a number of guests, and I apologize for not mentioning those, but I was sitting with Rear Admiral Henry H. Bell, who's in charge in the Coast Guard, in charge of the Great Lakes District, and we're pleased to have you and other guests with us today. Next week, our speaker will be Congresswoman Barbara Mikulski from Baltimore, Maryland. Her topic will be the impact of the budget on women and children. Be sure to make your reservations early for this important address. Now for our questions for Secretary Lehman. We have 2 microphones, one in the front with Alan Davis, one in the rear with Bob Cavano. Raise your hand to be recognized. First question, please. Mr. Lehman?
Yes. Mr. Secretary, if the Soviets have made little or no progress in 40 years to gain approval or respect for their system around the world, what justification is there to spend so many hundreds of billions of dollars in a defense operation?
Well, because unfortunately the Soviets, when they go into Afghanistan, don't do it by plebiscite. They do it with tanks and they do it with weapons that they have built up at enormous expense. I recall a professor that I had at Cambridge University who used to say that although man is intellectually and morally far superior to the alligator, he should not depend on that while swimming in the Ganges.
Secretary Lehman, last month, Admiral Hyman Rickover made some very provocative statements. One of them was that the only defense against annihilation is in the area of defense. He also said if he were put in charge of disarmament, there would be results. Would you care to comment?
Well, I believe that it is true that if Admiral Rickover were put in charge of disarmament, it would be a very lively negotiation indeed. I believe that the prospects for disarmament are good once we establish an incentive for the Soviets to disarm. We have done exactly the opposite for the last 15 years. Why should they make any sacrifices in facing up to the demands of their military, while we have demonstrated to them that the payoff to their military increases is so visible and real? The only successes that the Soviets can point to have been the successes brought about by their military capabilities. Yet while they have engaged in this buildup, we, as Harold Brown in the Carter administration used to say, we build, they build, we disarm, they build. The fact is we have disarmed, certainly in the Navy. We have halved our fleet from 1,000 ships to 480 ships. We have halved the number of our aircraft carriers from 24 just 12 years ago to 12 today. So the prospects for disarmament, I believe, are good once we establish in the minds of the Soviets that they can no longer gain real political payoffs by building more nuclear weapons. And I think that day will be upon us once we establish a firm defense posture that enables us to negotiate a deal to reduce nuclear weapons for all sides.
Mr. Secretary, it came to my mind about 2 years ago or 11, Ambassador of the United Nations, Bush, who is now Vice President, came here, like you same podium, deliver a speech. We don't need armaments. We came now from Moscow, Nixon President, Kissinger, in himself. So after he pacified us, we need the olive branch, the tongue. This is the name of the game. I got up and I cited a Latin proverb, which was taught by me, my professor of international law, who was a judge also in the International Court of League. Civis pacem, parabellum. If you want peace, prepare war. And later he admitted it was detrimental for us, no beneficial. Now, after years passed, I came to my memory also, the President Eisenhower blamed all our trouble to military-industrial complex. Now, I see a ray of hope. They are now the contractors, lower the prices, we hope. No question, we have to be $1 billion spent to defend ourselves. My question is this a ray of hope now, not to criticize the military-industrial complex, to have a little lower the prices, because Russia can produce cheap and we spend sometimes too high. How you can prevent this?
I believe it's more than a ray, it's a beam of hope. Thank you. Yeah.
The Secretary, it's been many years since I did research work on missile nose cone configurations at NASA. But with that in mind, I have some questions concerning the nuts and bolts of what you're trying to do. To retrofit a battleship instead of 4 or 5 smaller ships, to build a $10 billion carrier instead of 4 or 5 smaller ones, to prevent the concentration and the ability to hit these things with guided missiles, nuclear, etc., which is very easy from 700 miles away, it appears to be a poor strategic use of our dollars, because it It doesn't multiply the number of targets. It concentrates the targets the Russians can hit. And secondarily, although you answer the question concerning retention, gone from 28 to 48%, might that not reflect the poor economic conditions in the civilian world, and where you're going to find more people to man these ships if it's so hard to keep them in the first place?
Well, that's the subject of about 2 hours of speech right there. Let me try to answer it briefly. The battleships are one of the most cost-effective deals I've ever seen in government. It would be nice, and you'd have a legitimate issue if you could, in fact, get 4 or 5 smaller capable surface combatants for the price of one battleship. That's about what the ratio of a new construction battleship would be. The Kirov, for instance, that the Soviets have just deployed. But luckily, past taxpayers, my parents and some of your parents and some of you yourselves, have paid for those battleships at great cost in the past. They are as fast as the latest new nuclear battle cruiser that the Soviets have deployed, the Kirov. They are more survivable than any other ship. And they cost the taxpayer today the price of one small frigate, not 4 or 5. One frigate with one 3-inch gun. So the price is the best deal going. We are going to deploy them with cruise missiles and harpoons and Gatling guns and electronic warfare equipment. They will be the latest modern technology on the hardest, most survivable, most armored hull the world has ever seen. As to the argument about aircraft carriers being vulnerable and we're concentrating too big a ships, we should divide it up into smaller. There's no doubt, if you take the price of a Nimitz, you could build 2 very small 30,000-ton instead of the 90,000-ton Nimitz, 2 small aircraft carriers, but you could not protect them as you protect the Nimitz. Those 2 carriers, and we have done extensive analysis, computer analysis, and real-world simulation, there is no question that those 2, no matter how you disperse them, will get sunk far faster by fewer cruise missiles than the one Nimitz, because the Nimitz has an air wing of interceptors and protection of its own that cannot be supported in as large a size by a smaller carrier, and you cannot afford with a smaller ship to protect the ship with double hulls as we have in the Nimitz and baffling side armor and automatic damage control, triple armored decks and so forth. You can't do that in a small ship. You cannot afford to put the kind of phased array total defense around a lot of ships that you can around a carrier. To get a cruise missile through an outer barrier and through an inner interceptor barrier and then through the Aegis air defense system is a very formidable task. If you disperse those assets, in effect, the Soviets' task becomes divide and more easily conquer, because they have deployed already some 30,000 cruise missiles. So if we get even a 5-to-1 ratio, you're not going to be able to exhaust their cruise missiles. As far as the personnel, how can we man a growing Navy? The fact is we are getting better dramatically today. Retention is the highest in peacetime history for the Navy and the Marine Corps. And it's quality people that we're holding on to. More than that, we're bringing back in about 1,000 a month, the highest rate in peacetime history of people who left during the bad years of the welfare lines and so forth. This, we are confident, is going to stay in that direction. We are getting rid of the deficits of petty officers we had, and we are on track to grow steadily about 70,000 to 80,000 more. Is the economy helping us? Of course it is. Will our quotas drop after the economy turns around? I don't think so. There is no correlation in recruiting figures. Take Houston, 4% unemployment, the best Marine recruiting district in the country. Take Long Island, only 5% unemployment. One of the top 2 Navy recruiting districts in the country. So there is no direct correlation. We think we are reestablishing the prestige and the excitement of military service in the country. It is an attractive, exciting life now. We are restoring a livable wage so that They don't have to force their families to go on food stamps while they deploy. And so I think we're on track. One of the most successful, again, government programs I've ever seen. The wise moves that Congress took over the last 2 years to put in the bonuses and restore the livability. A great cost-effective move.
Mr. Secretary, you said that we were a maritime nation needing to import and to live. Yet immediately after World War II, we dismantled our merchant navy, gave it away to other nations, and God forbid if there was something like Pearl Harbor, how ready would our merchant navy be? How would this affect our defense posture, and what could we do about it?
The merchant marine, I guess Alfred Thayer Mahan, the great philosopher of naval theory, said it best, that a navy without a strong merchant marine is like a growth without roots. It will wither away. And we are seeing our merchant marine decline in a very precipitous manner. It is not that the ships themselves are disappearing. The trend since the Second World War has been they have simply gone under foreign flags of convenience. And that has created complications in our ability to count on them in time of war. In time of war, 95% of our logistics must go by sea, no matter how large our airlift is. Today, we have a critical problem because our merchant marine is shrinking at an even faster rate since the subsidies for the construction differential and the operating subsidies have been dropped. And this is causing us to take a dramatic new turn in how we ensure that we have sufficient lift. What the U.S. Navy is doing now is going out on the world market and procuring ships that are no longer competitive and buying them now in large numbers starting this year and putting them in the reserve fleet so that they'll be ready on a 10-day standby. That's part of the solution. It is by no means a total solution. As a nation, we must face up to the issue of the American merchant marine, the disappearance thereof. We in the Navy, we think, have the capability, but it's going to cost more money. Money that we're going to have to buy ships that we used to be able to count on that were in the commercial markets. But we can ensure it by prudent acquisition and charter and so forth to ensure that we have the logistics. But it will be difficult.
Mr. Secretary, you said that the Soviets are about 30% larger in naval ships than the United States. I'm confused because I read the works of the Defense Monitor and Rear Admiral Jean Larac, who's spoken to this club twice, and he says that when we include our allies, we have 445 major surface ships, while the Soviets have 235. We have some 13 aircraft carriers. The Soviets have 1 or 2. According to this Rear Admiral, our tonnage exceeds that of the Soviets by about 2 to 1. The figures are very confusing to me.
Well, there is no question that we could not carry out a strategy of maritime superiority without the substantial contribution that our allies provide. We have a number of advantages. Let me start by cold numbers. The numbers in the Soviet fleet are about 1,700. They have about 3 times the number of attack submarines that we have. We are not calling on growing the Navy fleet to parity in numbers with the Soviet fleet. We're asking for a 600-ship Navy, not a 1,700-ship Navy. Their gross tonnage is now about even with our gross tonnage. But that's not an adequate measure. The measure is, what is our task? Our task is to keep access to those areas that we have to be able to get to. And their task is the opposite, to cut it. So comparing numbers is really a very secondary issue. When we count on the advantages we have, they don't come in terms of numbers. They come in terms, first and foremost, of geography. Geography is on our side. Geography gives us a tremendous capability to deny them the use of the seas in time of war, if we have a sufficiently large force to take advantage of it with simultaneity. The allies that we have are a tremendous advantage. It is a fact that all of the great maritime nations are on our side. The European navies, the Japanese Defense Force, small but excellent, and the Australian and other Far Eastern navies, small but specialized and good, all on our side. When you calculate those together, we have the capability, if we can develop what is missing today, and that is an adequate U.S. strike force that can take advantage of those inherent geographic and allied environments in which to operate. And if we can restore that, that gives us confidence. We can make it clear to the Soviets that they will lose any attempt to interdict our sea lanes, and by so losing, make it virtually impossible for them to carry out an aggression in Central Europe or Afghanistan or elsewhere, engaging U.S. vital interests. Thank you.
Mr. Secretary, how does the Navy assess its capability in two areas? Number one, how is its technological capability both in aircraft and in weapon systems and compared to the Soviet? Secondly, how does it assess its capability to carry out two missions simultaneously, for example, a Vietnam mission as in the past, and simultaneously a Middle Eastern mission?
Well, first, the technology issue. The Soviets are extremely good at copying our technology, stealing our technology, buying our technology, and applying it. The history of the leakage of technology to the Soviet Union is is a very sad history in my judgment, because it's cost we in the West a great deal of money. We have put the money into developing microchips and innovations in composite technologies and so forth, and they have acquired it without that upfront R&D investment and applied it. Their Kirov nuclear battlecruiser has a phased array radar that we will not be able to get into the fleet for at least another 3 years. They have a vertical launch system, a VLS, for 3 different types of missiles, which we will not be able to deploy for about 4 years. They have the latest in electronic warfare capability. We have seen, and those of you in the metallurgy industry well know, the Soviets lead the world in the technology of titanium. And their titanium submarine, the Alpha, which we have no comparable submarine, demonstrates how far ahead of us they are in certain technologies. The Alpha is faster and goes considerably deeper than our best submarine. So they are good, but we overall have a better matrix of technology. The trouble is we have not been able to apply it because of the defense cutbacks in sufficient numbers to get the leverage that superior quality could provide. The second part of your question was what?
The ability to handle missions in 2 locations simultaneously.
It is important to recognize a major change has come about in the environment of warfare for the Navy, and that is brought about by this deployment of permanent blue water navies by the Soviets around the world. There never used to be a Soviet Pacific fleet. Today now they have major naval bases in Cam Ranh Bay in Vietnam and Da Nang in Vietnam, forward operating bases now around the periphery of Africa and the Eurasian landmass. They are there permanently. There are now 130 ships in the permanent blue water Pacific fleet. And we are intertwined every day. Unlike the other services, we interact with the Soviets day in and day out. There is nearly always a Kashin destroyer within a couple of 100 yards of one of our aircraft carriers. We go into their exercises. They intrude into ours. They run close surveillance attacks on our battle groups at sea. In fact, we were literally bumping up against each other so much that 10 years ago we had to go to Moscow and negotiate a kind of rules of the road for the interaction, and it's the Incidents at Sea treaty that was signed between the two to kind of regulate how our 2 fleets interact. So there's no such thing as a limited naval war for us. certainly limited it to conventional, because I don't believe we'll go nuclear at sea. But there is no option of saying, oh, well, we'll limit the war to the Middle East because they're sinking our ships in the Straits of Hormuz. You can't do that. Immediately a war breaks out that engages directly the Soviet Navy and the U.S. Navy, it is a global war, because obviously we are not going to sit by while a Minsk battle group steams to attack our battle group in the Indian Ocean as it goes through the Straits of Malacca. We're going to sink it. And so while you can talk sensibly about regionally isolated wars on land, it is no longer possible to intellectually to conceive of such a war engaging the U.S. and the Soviet Union at sea. It would be instantaneously a global war at sea.
Mr. Secretary, it would seem to the layman that the Navy and the Air Force and the Army and the other branches must do tremendous infighting when you communicate what your defense needs are among the branches. And that when you then combine these to put together a $25 billion budget, I can imagine how much fighting probably took place for the Navy to get its share and the Air Force its and so forth. In your opinion, do you feel that the structure of the Department of Defense in total is working correctly so that you get a share, which the Navy should get, and take into consideration what the other branches of the service need, so that the coordinated effort is one total defense policy, not a separate Navy policy, Air Force, and so forth?
Without question. I think the most significant management development in government for the last 20 years has been Cap Weinberger's reorganization of the Pentagon. There has been a total reorganization of the way business is done in the Department of Defense, which goes to a new decentralized form that places responsibility for operating, both authority and responsibility, on the service secretaries, but subject to the daily policy supervision of the Secretary and the Deputy Secretary of Defense. We have established a group called the Defense Resources Board that includes the Secretary of Defense and the Deputy Secretary and the service secretaries and the service chiefs and the undersecretaries of defense, all sitting around a table. We meet on the average of a couple of times a week, and the issues, and we start in the year, the budget cycle, as we call it, starts with a long-range planning document. What are the national objectives that we are given? And then we derive from that the force levels that would be necessary. And within that are submitted the requirements to meet that strategy that each service sees for itself. We then try to discuss the varying calls on big budget items, debate the issues, with everybody having a fair say to argue their case, and then the ultimate product, which is sent over to the White House, is an agreed and decided by the Secretary of Defense best allocation of resources among the services to carry out the strategy. I think that there has been a remarkably little inter-service rivalry and backbiting in the way this process has worked. We don't see, as we have seen in some periods in the past, the Air Force surreptitiously working against the Navy's program in Congress and the Navy surreptitiously working against the Armies, etc. There is basic consensus about what is needed. All the services need modernizing, and some systems are requiring more of a call than others.
Mr. Secretary, what is the present status of our so-called mothballed fleets?
The mothballed fleets are a mobilization asset to us that we are now beginning to draw from the bank. The size is, I don't have the exact number at this point. We have two categories of it. It includes basically a combination of ships that are obsolete but could do low-threat missions like retired destroyers, and ships that are up to date but not needed for the overall strategy like the cruisers, the Salem-class cruisers, which only have about 7 years of use on them and are very good mobilization assets, or the 5 27 Charlie-class, Essex-class aircraft carriers that we have thought about bringing 1 or 2 back on active duty, but they're there as excellent mobilization assets. When we feel that they no longer have the capability to help defense in time of war, then they get scrapped. So we're constantly auditing and re-auditing the assets. It is not that large. It's nothing like it used to be in the 50s and 60s. It's on the order of, I'd hesitate to put a number on it at this point.
Mr. Secretary, I'm going to read from the radical mouthpiece Wall Street Journal. The Secretary of Defense has yet to identify a single big-ticket weapon in production or even one nearing production which he deems worthy of cancellation, even where his budget embraces a new weapons approach. We want it all, he says. The Pentagon has... can you tell us if this is an accurate statement?
No, it's not an accurate.
Or if you
it's not an accurate statement because just in the Department of the Navy, we have canceled in the last 6 months about 43 major and minor programs, and defense-wide, it's well over 100 of major programs that have been canceled. We can't afford everything, and we've had to make the hard choices. Even though many of them are resisted in Congress for special local interest groups. But whoever wrote that article simply doesn't know what he's talking about.
Mr. Secretary, the defense budget will probably be greatly debated in the Congress, and possibly some compromise will be the result. What's your prediction as your own Navy budget, withstanding the inroads of Congress?
I would be willing to predict with some confidence, if not total conviction, that we are going to come through this year with solid support for our program. There are always changes made, some adds, some subtracts. But I believe that the consensus of the American people is strong that we need to restore the Navy. And I think the polling data, the recent ABC polls that show nearly 60% of the American people either support the current defense level or think it should be increased, reflects the basic consensus, and that will bring us through with this naval recovery program well on the way. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us. Our program is adjourned.